And I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences here at SUU. And I am so happy to welcome you to today's A.P.E.X talk. And I just want to take a minute and thank Dr. Lynn Vartan for doing such a fabulous job. I think the A.P.E.X season has been wonderful so far, and Lynn is the reason for that. And I just want to ask us all to just give her a little hand. I am privileged today to introduce to you Matt Bell. When I was reading Appleseed, his latest book, I couldn't help but think how timely it is, but also how interesting the novel is in its ability to pull aspects of science fiction, fantasy, and just quite honestly beautiful prose together to create a piece at times both bleak yet hopeful, scientific yet very humanities-driven. In her interview with Matt, Lauren Gilger noted that Appleseed is an epic, speculative, environmental novel that takes place across 3 storylines over 1,000 years. It begins in the late 18th century with a mythological retelling of the story of Johnny Appleseed, moves to the more contemporary story of John and his small group of rewilders who hope to return Earth to some healthier semblance of its past, and then shifts to the story of C, a lonely, sentient being living 700 years in the future on a now ice-covered North America, which we can probably relate to after the last few days. The interweaving of these stories culminates in an amazing finale that I guarantee you will love. It's one of those few endings in a book that just feels right. Matt's craft book, Refuse to Be Done, A Guide to Novel Writing, Rewriting, and Revision, will come out in early 2022 from Soho Press. He is also the author of the novels Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection, A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, and several other titles. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, Conjunctions, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, and many other publications. A native of Michigan, Matt is an associate professor who teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. On that note, I want to turn this talk, which will be a conversation with Todd Peterson and Lynn Vartan, and give you a chance to get to know Matt Bell as well. So, please come up.
Welcome back! Yay!
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Dean Green, for your introduction. This is my first in-person reading since 2019, so thank you so much for having me and for coming out today. It means a lot to me.
That's awesome. Sweet. And we are joined on stage by our very own Todd Peterson. Welcome, Todd. Tell us, Todd, tell us, for anybody who might not know who you are, tell the audience who you are.
Well, I teach in the English department. I teach creative writing, and I also teach in our new upcoming BFA in film program. I teach that kind of stuff, so it's a blending of worlds.
And you're the one who really introduced Matt and Matt's writing to me. I wondered if you might just let us know, how do you guys know each other?
This is a story for the 21st century. Matt and I met online, where there's a pretty thriving community of writers, since we're dispersed across the country and sometimes the world. And when I was sort of entering into my kind of national level publishing career, my publicist said, you need to get online and do some stuff. And as I did, I found Matt and a few other people who were doing something really remarkable, which is using social media to connect, to support each other's work. And Matt has been that kind of person. And so as he was talking about Appleseed, which he did online, which we're both supposed to, right? Like the contract said we're supposed to do that. But then he was also doing it out of a genuine sense of what was going on, and I went, what? I have got to read this book. And so I begged and begged, and I got an ARC, which is the advanced reader's copy, and that helps you to kind of gets you your mind ready for a book. And then when I read it, I said, I need to get him up here, because I know that we're having these conversations. And I just felt like Matt would plug in so well to the long-standing discussions about art, the humanities, science, intersections, just as the Dean was talking about. And it all worked out. It was great. I mean, there's a pandemic in the middle of all this, so it's hard to make sure that stuff like this can happen.
Well, that is just so cool because, we're just like going deep right away. I mean, we're going to get into Appleseed, and I know you promised to read for us a little bit, but just to kind of set the stage, I mean, Dean Breen did such a great job of saying, let's get to know you. So I'd love to dip into, you are very passionate about that community making online. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you feel about that, how you cultivate that, and that whole aspect of your career.
Sure, thanks. You know what? I started writing when I was maybe 20 or 21. I was living in rural Michigan. I'm in a small town called Hemlock, and I wrote my first short stories when I was living in my parents' basement out in the country. And you might imagine there were not like tons of other writers just like hanging around. And so the online communities I was in, which that was all kind of pre-social media, so back then it was like message boards and blog comments and things like that. But like that was really where I met the first other writers I knew, the first other people who read the kind of books I was reading. And so I've always been part of online communities. It's always been part of connecting with other people. And when I was first in those spaces, I didn't have a lot of my own work to talk about or promote, right? Like I hadn't written anything yet, I hadn't published anything. I wouldn't publish anything for 5 or 6 years after I started writing seriously. But what I could do was talk about other people's writing, talk about other books I liked. And one of the things about championing other people's work is you inevitably find the other people who love that kind of work. And I guess I don't really know why I had this idea, but it's really clear to me at like 22 or 23 that the more I champion the kind of work I like, the more readers there might eventually someday be for the kind of work I was doing as well, that those two things are related. And that like finding a bigger audience for writers you love would also one day be like building the audience that would be there for you as well. Not done in this like quid pro quo way, but like there is a sort of like you build the communities you want to participate in, which seems like part of the task. And the opportunities at the university as well.
It's so amazing because it seems like such a positive force. I mean, do you have any advice for students who may be thinking, well, I'd like to kind of build community online. You started sort of as a college age.
Yeah.
What advice might you have for anybody who's kind of thinking, I'd like to build some community?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that sometimes people hold back because they're nervous about like, will people want to hear my voice, or will people accept that, or will I just be speaking the void and like no one will sort of talk back, which is daunting. Maybe I've never been maybe as afraid to talk as I should be, so maybe that in some ways it's easier for me. But I think I was nervous about that. But I really think you'd be surprised as writers, maybe in all fields, of how little people hear about their work, like how few letters you get about like the work you're writing, or how few like sort of genuine interactions you have. One of my favorite writers, Karen Russell, who's about the same age as me, maybe even slightly younger. When her first book came out when she was 26, she had stories in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, and Grant, and all these huge magazines, and graduate of Columbia's MFA program, was just like really lauded person. I've loved her work in magazines, and when her book came out, and this is before I was publishing anything, right? Like, this is pre like me being anyone could know at all. Her first book came out, I read it like the day it came out, and then I tried to find her online to like send her a note, like a fan note, and I contacted her through MySpace, when there was MySpace, and I sent her a note, and she was like, I love your writing, I love your book, I'm so happy for you, and she wrote me back right away and was like, you're the only person who's not like part of like my publishing team, my grad school friends, who's like ever written me something about my work. And it started a correspondence that has continued over the years, and it's sort of amazing sometimes, like, people do want to hear from you, and people do want to connect with you, and other writers you admire, especially people who are maybe your age or sort of seem like they're doing the same work as you. You just reach out and you start making those connections.
And let me direct your attention to the upper right-hand corner of Appleseed. This isn't the quid pro quo, but people wonder sometimes where these blurbs come from. and they come from the relationship.
Yes, absolutely.
They don't come because you go like, can I pay you $150 to
Right.
write a book?
Yeah.
That is so wonderful and so meaningful. Just that message to reach out with, especially with positive. If you read something and you like it, or you see a concert and you like it, reach out to the person. And you're absolutely right. It's surprising how little we hear about that. So that's great advice.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
Of course.
Well, let's dig into Appleseed.
Sure.
So we heard a great sort of introduction to Appleseed by Dean Breen in her introduction. I want to know, now that it's been out for a bit of time, how do you describe Appleseed?
Yeah, when Dean Breen was talking, I was like, maybe I'll take the Dean with me everywhere I go, because that was such a good description of the book. I think I use some of the similar terms. I talk about it as this 1,000-year environmental epic, sort of dividing these three sections of the past, the present, and the future. And one of the reasons the book's that way, although I discovered this as I was writing, I didn't start out sort of knowing this, is that some of the things I was talking about, like climate change and manifest destiny and capitalism and some of these different sort of forces that shape the characters in the book, don't exist just in one place, right? They're not present only in 1799 or only in 2079, where the future part of the book is, or only in the far future. That they sort of shape us through time. And there's a little bit of the book that takes place like inside like ancient Greek myth. Like there's this attempt to have like the story that the book is telling be very big. And part of that's because I think some of the stories that we're sort of born into and that we live inside and enact are old and they've been around for a long time, and they can be a little invisible to us. And that one of the things novels can do is sort of like highlight those sort of conditions around us, and by showing other characters sort of recognizing them or striving against them or enacting them or sort of being part of them.
Yeah. And I'd be curious for both of you to answer this. The genre, speculative fiction, is not a genre that I was familiar with really going into this, but now I know a lot more about it. Now, being an author in it and being a teacher of it, how do you all describe speculative fiction? What really is it?
I think there's like a publishing industry answer, which is that speculative fiction is science fiction for people who don't think they like science fiction. It's like a trick where they call it speculative fiction. Sometimes that means it has a certain level of like prose quality or something, but even that, like there's a lot of very well written like science fiction and fantasy written as that. It's a bit of a catch-all. I personally am like a really genre agnostic reader and writer. Like I love a lot of different things. This book is a lot of different genres. I think there are mythological elements, there are fantastical elements, there's these sort of high technology science fiction parts. There's an adventure story sort of crossing this glacier. The middle part of the book is structured like a heist, which I know Todd's teaching class on heist right now. I love the heist. And so there's a little bit of like, maybe there's 6 or 7 genres like mashed into the book together. When I was selling the book, I had a couple conversations with editors. There were a handful of editors interested in the book. And these were all meant to be complimentary things. I think the editors were flattering me. And one said, like, this is like science fiction. This isn't like your literary writing at all. And I was like, sure. And the next editor was like, this isn't science fiction. This is speculative fiction. This is literary speculative fiction. This is, high art. And I was like, sure. Like, it doesn't matter that much to me, right?
Yeah,
like, I think
right.
I really read and teach and write across genre lines. So where they put in the bookstore matters to me less than maybe it does other people.
How about you?
So when the art came, I said, hey, good luck. Matt's going to get me an arc of his new book. And she goes, okay, well, what is it? And my wife is a big fan of David Mitchell.
Yeah.
And so I kind of did the Venn diagram game that we oftentimes do with marketing teams. I said, well, it's like Cloud Atlas meets Rachel Carson.
Right.
And then when I said that, she goes, oh,
yeah.
This is fantastic. And so I think that's one of the things that people do to capture the imagination. What is the thing that you know? And then in what way is this occupying a space that maybe isn't quite what you know, but it is enough what you know so that people will take the risk on it. So that's what I've been telling people for a long time.
Like
sometimes they go, Cloud Atlas? And I'm like, okay, maybe you're not going to dig that space, but Cloud Atlas for that big spanning thing with the time span. But it's not to say that you've taken anything from it, because it...
I mean, I love Cloud Atlas, right?
Yeah, it does. It's doing something different. Yeah. But to back into the speculative fiction, a mutual friend of ours, Brian Evanson, who is my dissertation director, he's out there in that space too, and he helped us kind of get along. He understood what those things meant, but also he didn't despise anything. He's really a big deal in horror, in literary horror right now, with Peter Straub and other writers like that. But he does stuff that is at various times neo-noir or science fiction or straight-up horror, or things that feel, I would say, like speculative true crime.
Yeah.
And so what's really cool...
Like speculative true crime.
I might have said that. But in that space, there's a lot of crossover. This is where I write as well, where there's something that's known, and then you can bring along something that's unknown. Speculative fiction, though, I mean, this is science fiction. It is what the best science fiction always did, which is to capture our imagination with a surface that's interesting and compelling, kind of like a candy coating, like M&Ms or something. But then inside there is something. There's always something, whether it's childhood's end. I'll just stay there. I mean, the list could go on forever. Where it's like, oh, wait a minute. Wow, I'm supposed to be thinking about what's going on. As I read this, it's not just make-believe.
Right. Well, there's all those ways in which it like defamiliarizes you, right? So your guard goes down. Like you sort of like, it acts on you different than an op-ed. You know, you were talking about those elevator pitches, which I think sometimes are actually useful to people. And I was joking before I sent the book out that what I was writing was like an episode of Westworld, if it was written by Annie Dillard and Wendell Berry, and then you added witches and fawns, and like that's pretty much it too, right? Sort of this like naturalist science fiction with myth, sort of trying to find those spaces.
Well, I think we've whet everybody's appetite enough. Would you mind reading for us? Yeah, great.
So I'm going to read. This feels very story time to be in this fancy chair with my book. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book. This is from Chapman's point of view. So this is starts in 1799. This is this half human, half animal fawn from Greek myth retelling of Johnny Appleseed. Him and his brother Nathaniel. Nathaniel is his older brother in the book. The real life John Chapman had a brother Nathaniel too, but he's a younger brother. So I fudged the history for reasons. And so this is them coming out of Pennsylvania back into what's then the Ohio Territory before Ohio was a state at the sort of beginning of another spring of apple planting. Thank you again for listening. Chapman wakes in the cold and the dark and the wet pre-dawn slush to the sound of his brother Nathaniel, already up and tending to the sputtering ashes of last night's fire, cursing and shivering, huddled beneath his only blanket. Despite Nathaniel's ministrations, the coals beneath the ashes stay dead, the gathered wood wet, breakfast impossible. Shouting himself out from his bedroll, Chapman rises to, offering his brother a grunted good morning before stamping his cloven hooves against the frigid ground, trying to quicken blood sluggish with sleep. As first light breaks, he stalks silently away from their campsite, climbing the last ridgeline of his Pennsylvanian mountain pass to watch the night's rainfall trickle off into morning mist, admiring the fine, accidental melody of clean water falling branch to branch. A moment later, beautiful Nathaniel follows along, dragging their bags and tools to where Chapman waits upon his outcropping of rock, one clawed hand raised to shield his golden eyes as he surveys the forest of frost today. Snowpack still jamming the forest shadows, sparkling ice coating its swampy glacial kettles and its irregular lakes. All this waiting beauty backlit now by the red shroud of sunrise, the new day's dawn setting aglow a vast world not yet fully explored. This, brother, Nathaniel says, placing one calloused hand on taller Chapman's bare brown shoulder, waving the other out over the territory below, this is where we'll make our fortune. Pointing out the first landmarks they're due to pass today, he traces a path out of this mountain gap and down to the slim strand of tilled earth that gives entrance to the Ohio Territory, then the way beyond into the unsettled, unmapped forest swamps of the interior, past the river bottomlands and sheltered ravines where they sowed last year's nurseries, toward the next uninhabited acres where they'll aim to plant this year's seeds. As Nathaniel happily details his plans, Chapman smiles his much-practiced smile, his sharp teeth slipping from beneath his broad lips. Look, brother, he interrupts, pointing out dim campfires barely visible through the morning mist, flickers of flame and smoke rising in far-off sheltered dales. There are so many more of us this year. Every year, these fires move deeper into the landscape, each one a distant sign of strangers come to expand the human mark, to put the land to what Nathaniel has taught Chapman are its rightful uses. Here are settlers hunting and trapping and gathering wild foodstuffs, cutting down trees and tearing up rocks, to make room for placeholder farms, making way for the towns to come, while others tap trees for sap and hang tin sugaring buckets over hot coals, sometimes passing the time with amateur fiddling, the inviting sounds of their instruments carrying across even the most desolate, starless, moonless nights. Together, the brothers measure again the increasingly believable potential of this territory. It's a wilderness cleared by war, then emptied by treaty. As he has at the start of every other year's journey, Nathaniel tells Chapman again how this taken land can now be brought to heel by industrious men, how by many hands the foundations of a new civilization will be laid here, the land year by year made ready for the coming of more people, until one day the uncultivated earth gives way to what he says will surely be the grandest of cities, each graced by the tallest buildings and the widest avenues, all populated by an endless parade of hardy settlers, planting horizon-busting fields of wind-tilted golden grain, harvesting fruitful orchards planted by these two forward-thinking brothers. Chapman and Nathaniel and these others gathered around their distant fires are only the first to come, he says. Even if our industries should fail entirely, Nathaniel concludes, surely we will not be the last. Nathaniel has said this for 10 years now, the same lines recited from the same mountain path at the outset of each year's venture. It's time to go, Chapman says, suddenly impatient with his brother's story. He ties his bedroll and his tools over one bare shoulder, slings his leathern seed bag around the other. The morning air is chilled and damp, but the bark of his skin keeps him warm enough that even in winter he wears no shirt or coat, only a pair of trousers hacked off above his inhuman knees. He dusts the last of the night's frost from his flanks, then whinnies lowly, stretching tall to rub the smooth shells of his curved horns with his clawed hands, first his broken horn, and then his intact twin for luck. Nathaniel laughs, then mimics his brother's superstitions, rubbing his own bare temples, where just recently a few gray hairs had started creeping through the brown. Meet you at the river, Nathaniel teases, sidestepping onto the narrow trace path leading down the ridgeline, if you can catch me. He rushes to build his slim head start, but his advantage doesn't last long. A moment later, Chapman surges past him to drop down the steep plunge of the mountainside, his hooves sliding precariously on loose scree as he picks up speed, the joy of moving fast, filling him from the inside out, his fur standing on end, his heart leaping with happy effort. He quickens his pace with every step until a barking cry rips free of him, the sound of his voice, foreign enough to this territory and every other, to frighten all the nearby roosting birds into sudden, startled flight, the gray sky filling with their black silhouettes, their many cries joining the whooping of this one fawn, returned at last to wildest lands.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. But Todd, I want to give you an opportunity first. I think you may probably have tons of questions.
Well, I want to mention something that might suggest, because I kind of know where we're going, to see different passages of the things that are going on. And as people try to define different kinds of science fiction, some terms that have come up that have been really interesting. You know, they've talked about steampunk. Like Jeff Vandermeer brought a lot of that to play. But it's an aesthetic that, you know, is chosen specifically to do something that's maybe really speculative, which is science that's kind of out of conjunction with the normal time. Mm-hmm. So in these Chapman sections, I was kind of trying to come up with a scheme, which is what kind of punk are the Chapman sections? And I was like, okay, how about cotton gin punk? Sure. if that fits. And so then I was wondering, like, if we were to kind of go through and say, well, what is this and what is the aesthetic? Because in addition to there being 3 different characters and 3 different plot lines and some blending of those plot lines, they're also distinct aesthetically. Like they're distinct in their language, the images that you use and whatever. So I thought, you know, maybe as we proceed through, we could say, okay, if we accept the conceit that this is cotton gin punk, like what are we getting from this kind of 1790s moment? Because usually historical fiction like that feels different
than what
this is.
You know, I teach classes in world building and science fiction and fantasy, and we talk about the punk things. You can put punk at the end of anything and create a new genre of science fiction, right?
Diesel punk, lollipop punk, whatever.
Old punk, solar punk, bug punk, like there's all these punks. this is hoof punk or something, right? It seems good. One of the things that you always have to do, I think, when you're doing something fabulous or doing something sort of working with magical elements, is you have to figure out how much like magic the book can hold. Like there's sort of, and without it, and when you're writing something historical, the more magic you put in, the more the world changes around it, right? There's sort of the consequences of your world building that you're sort of figuring out. So Chapman's like a big thing, right? Like you have this hoofed, horned, sort of mythological creature running around. There are also 3 witches that appear in this part of the book, and they're carrying with this book is so weird, and they're carrying with them this disembodied head that is like singing this sort of terrible atonal song, which is part of an Orpheus and Eurydice retelling that's put through the book. So that was like a lot of magic already. And at some point, there were more things in other versions of the book. I really love Paul Bunyan as well, and I tried to have these like giant Paul Bunyan characters moving around, but it was too much. It was like messing up American history once there were like giants running around too. So it had to really just be this one thing, and it works partly because Chapman's in the wilderness and not in a place where people would see him. But I think one of the things that opens up for me in the book, which is the other part, like what does the magic allow you to do that a straight historical retelling would not, is that people in 1799 could not have had our kind of environmental beliefs. It's partly some students who had talked to you yesterday might have already heard this, so I apologize, but like people then did not, at least in America, did not believe in extinction. It just wasn't a concept that people had. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote all this like anti-extinction stuff. He was obsessed with woolly mammoth fossils, and that we would find the woolly mammoth somewhere in the West because nothing that had been created could be destroyed. They also, I think, the idea of like running out of natural resources was not totally accessible to them the way it is now. Part of the reason why Europeans were in America was because they had run out of resources in Europe, but like at the same time there was just like always going to be more. Somewhere there would be more trees, somewhere there would be more coal, somewhere there would be more gold and silver. And so writing a straight historical piece set in that time would not actually allow me to approach much of that stuff. But Chapman's sort of half human, half animal, and his access to the natural world, his access to the human world, made some of that movement between the two worlds possible in that space. And it all sounds like I designed that. I discovered that writing, right? I didn't know that when I started. When I started, I was just like, wouldn't it be funny if Johnny Appleseed was a fawn? So like the beginning is not as smart as the end, right? But yeah, I think that opened up sort of possibility. And then the other timelines also allowed me to sort of look back or comment or bring in other things that if it had just been the 1799 book, the book wouldn't have been able to do that. I don't know if this happens to you. One of the things I think about a lot is like every novel has a tunnel vision based on its protagonist. It's hard for the book to think about things the protagonist can't think about. And so multiple protagonists allow you to do that to some extent. But I think I'm always looking for a way for the book to be able to see around its characters and around their limited perspective in different ways.
Totally happens. Well, and sometimes it takes somebody else to see what you're not seeing because you're close into the work.
Right.
And really, if you allow too many things in, it just becomes too much to manage. And I think that you've talked about that. What are the ideas that the writing of Appleseed produced that you've maybe stashed? Because you called me out on that when we did our launch event. Yeah, it's like, I see that there's some UFO stuff in this book. And I was like, there was too many things. I couldn't add that on top of it. So I was like, okay, I can carefully wrap this up and set this aside for later. And I'm wondering if there's some other ideas that you said, okay, Appleseed is full.
Right.
Because it's full. It's got all the things you're saying.
Enough.
But there's some things, thematic things or concept things that I want to address later. Do you have some stuff like that?
Yeah, I had the same experience. When I was in grad school, I was writing stories really fast, and I could feel this like every story was like 1.5 stories. Like the half left over from the thing you just written. This probably happens in music competition too, right? Like the half of the thing you have left over produces the next thing. There's sort of a chain there. If you could write a book that could do everything you want to do, you'd write one book and be done, right? It's sort of one of the reasons to write more books is this. I think for Appleseed, I think one of the things that I became as I was writing Appleseed is I became more of a utopianist, which seems weird for a book about that's about the end of humanity and climate change. I wanted to do more utopian thinking, more thinking about like imagining other ways we might live or other ways we might dwell on the earth. And this book does some of that, but is not really the focus of this book. And so I think some of the things I'm writing now are more directly thinking about like how things could be otherwise, how we could live differently, and trying to, Ursula Guin talks about like you can't get to a future you can't imagine, like we have to sort of imagine these other ways of being so we can arrive at them someday, and that seems really important to me. And that was something that as I was writing this book, I was like, if I was starting over from scratch, I would maybe have done more of that. But it was just, this book had its own trajectory by that point.
I want to circle back to something that you said, I think that could be really useful to the audience. You said, wouldn't it be cool if there was like this, Johnny Appleseed was a fawn?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think when people look at something finished, they don't realize there's a process.
Right.
Like sometimes and this isn't to dunk on my students, I think they think that like stories or novels get born kind of like a giraffe does, and then stands up and it starts walking off to eat.
And you have to feed the giraffe an awful lot to make it that, though.
Right, yeah, so it takes a while, and so I think it could be interesting if you could share a little bit, like, how did you move along, and then illuminate for yourself, oh, wait a minute, Matt, you're talking about this.
Yeah.
Because it isn't a conscious effort, at least in my experience, and not with most of the writers.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I talk about all the time in creative writing classes is like, it's why they're so valuable, why the workshop is valuable, is like when you go to the library, you go to the bookstore, you read finished books, those can tell you what like the novel can do, what the short story can do, but they don't show you anything about how they were made. It's just not visible in the final project usually. I think for me, it often starts with something very small. I'm not like an outliner. I don't know that much as I go. I do most of my research on my feet as I'm reading or as I'm writing. It's always built on some stuff I already know. Like I was already researching for my own personal ways of being in the world, things like industrial agriculture and things like that that are in the book. I was, just doing research to come to terms with myself as an eater, I think, And so some of that stuff fed into the book. But most of the thinking happens as it goes. There's a philosopher, environmental philosopher, maybe that's the right word for it, Donna Haraway, who I like quite a bit. And she has a book called Staying with the Trouble, and I think about that phrase, staying with the trouble, a lot, and I maybe don't use it exactly how she does, but I think about when I'm writing a novel and I'm doing all this research. I did tons of research for this book, right? Like environmental research, really supposed to about bioengineering and geoengineering the stratosphere and what kind of buttons people had in their pants in 1799 and like all these different things you have to know. And then you're also like solving plot problems and inventing character and fixing the sentences and cutting as much as it can so the book's only 500 pages long and doing all this work. And while you're doing that, you're staying with the like themes you're thinking about. And so like while I'm solving a plot problem, I'm still thinking about climate change. I'm still thinking about my own relationship to the earth and to animals and to plants and other people. And so I really think like the process of writing fiction becomes a way for me of staying with the thinking and the feeling of the things I care about. And so none of that time is wasted. That time is essential. Like the hard work of writing a book, it turns out to be the sort of gift to you as a thinker and as a person.
And when you're done, you have this book, and then it's like when you're doing a project in the workshop and you look back, and there's this mess. All of these things that aren't here, but they came off of. What's going to happen? You'll have to sweep that up at some point.
I'm sorry, Liz.
No, I was just going to say with regard to the editing process, also I think at one point you said that it was almost twice as long as it is now. Yeah. Could you talk about that or go off wherever you were headed?
No, that's great. I've an overwriter who cuts back. So I make more material than I need. One of the things is maybe that same process question you're asking is I write a first draft that I think of as a generative draft or an exploratory draft. I'm really just trying to like figure out what book I'm writing, and figuring out who I'm writing about. And so for this book, I think I wrote 200 pages or so of like a first draft that like I discovered the book. I'm like, okay, it's gonna be these three timelines, these three characters. This is some of what it's about. And then I stopped and I wrote an outline of the like book I wanted to write after having done like a year of work. And then I started writing that book, and I have a rule that I can use stuff from the first draft as long as I retype it. I don't let myself copy and paste. Copy and pasting isn't revising, it's just copying. But I end up not using a lot of it. Every book I write, I use less of that first draft because the prose changes as you go. And so I had this like 200 pages of stuff, and then the main draft of this book was like maybe 200 pages longer than this is. And then it's just sort of like cutting and making it as tight as possible. But yeah, there's like a book and a half of material that's not in the book that was essential to getting the book.
Why do you think that is that as time goes on you use less and less of your first draft?
I don't know if it's I think partly it's that maybe my first drafts have been a little looser, like that not finishing the first draft means that I didn't, see all of it. But I think the prose just keeps getting better, I think there's like the prose you write when you're trying to figure out what your story is, and then there's the prose you write with like the full knowledge of what your story is. And you want the final book to have that prose in it, where it's sort of these scenes were written, not me like trying to find what I'm doing, but like knowing what I'm doing. And so the sentences just keep getting better as you write, and so you end up not wanting to use this stuff. Or it's about a previous conception of the character, that version of the character no longer fits or something.
Right.
So it's not being a way to throw away what you've made for something better. We were maybe talking at dinner last night, like, I think I published my first story like 17 years ago. So if we only count the publishing part of my life as my writing career, like I've probably written like millions of words and published like maybe like 500,000, which still sounds crazy. But like most of what I write gets thrown away, but it's all useful, it's all process, it's all thinking, and every sentence you write is practice for the ones you'll publish.
While we're just on the research and that process part of it, one of the things that's so striking in all of it, but especially the part that you read this morning, is the imagery around the opening. And I know in our conversations you've been talking about influences, but I'm particularly curious about influences that help dictate the imagery for you. And I know you had said you watched a lot of things, and so I wonder if you could talk about inspiration in that way, particularly with regard to imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew one of the things pretty early on that I wanted to be sure of was that the natural world was depicted as like a place of sort of wonder and splendor and abundance, and all the storylines, even as things get sort of dire in the later ones. I had a sticky note on my desk that said, "Go big with wonder." That was sort of my like marching order for the book. That was the task as I saw it. And so some of the natural imagery is like my own time in the outdoors, right? I've always been a hiker and a backpacker, or now a trail runner and kayaker and different things, depending where I've lived. Grew up in the Midwest where I'm writing about, and so some of it's, sort of stuff you have in you. I've read a lot of nature writing, partly because I was trying to figure out the nature writing in this book. I mentioned Annie Dillard and Wendell Berry as being really important, but I read a lot of other people. The very beginning of the John section actually takes place in Utah, in Canyonlands, and which you can think about just right now. Yeah, there's this Utah part of the book too, for like 3 pages. And I know I haven't been to Canyonlands. That came out of something that I'd read, but the rest of that chapter is in Yellowstone, where I've been a couple times. There's the glacier part of the book I've been writing about for about a year, and I went to Iceland for work, and I stayed a couple extra days and hiked the glacier in Iceland and got to sort of like experience some of that firsthand. And so some of it's that. I watched a lot of movies just because, just to have that sort of imagery, lots of period pieces just to sort of see people in sort of period clothes and things like that. But yeah, just try, influence from every direction as much as possible. I really feel like some writers feel like they want to pretend they have no influences or want to stay uninfluenced. And I think I want, like, the more the better. I want, like, absolutely as much as I can. But even, like, small things. I watched the movie Last of the Mohicans as I was finishing the book, just because it's all, like, Daniel Day-Lewis, like, running through the woods. And I was just like, I just need, like, Chapman run through the woods. I just need to watch a guy jump off rocks for a while, like, small stuff. But, yeah, I feel like you have to keep that image bank sort of full as you're writing.
And again, that's just great advice. Well, that's great advice for all artists, right?
Yeah.
Keep that bank full, which I love. So maybe we could go on to a second reading now at this time.
Why don't I read? I will read from John's point of view. I'm going to read right after the Utah part. So this is John. This is like 2079, something like that. The year's not in the book, but about then. And you'll hear a little bit about the sort of political situation, but it's late climate change. Part of my thinking about writing this is one of the things that took a lot to figure out was like what the situation in the near future was. Near future is harder to write than far future or past, right? If you put it far enough in the past, you can sort of be squishy with details and the reader might not know. And if you put it far enough in the future, you can kind of do whatever you want. So the near future is hard because the cause and effect has to be plausible. So you'll hear some of the cause and effect. But basically I was writing a future in which we did little to nothing to sort of mediate climate change. Like the worst case scenario came true. John drives north into Wyoming, through the Grand Tetons, toward what was once Yellowstone. At the park's southern entrance, he retrieves his bolt cutters from the truck's bed, then clips the chain sealing the gate. His presence here is a crime unlikely to be punished. The Park Service already shuttered 10 years, but still he notes the solar panels powering roadside wireless readers, there to record his ID and report his trespass, a sure danger if he hadn't already disabled the pebble buried in his right hand, that inescapable bit of Earth Trust tech embedded now in nearly every American body. Earth Trust. After the catastrophic California earthquake finally struck, it was Earth Trust that pushed an emergency funding bill through the last true Congress in Washington, a rush order seizing all lands west of the Mississippi, and using eminent domain and the President's emergency powers to create the Western Sacrifice Zone, a long-planned takeover waiting only for the right shock. Half the country abdicated and sold the Earth Trust for dollars an acre by a weakened government busy fleeing to drier land in Syracuse. We hoped these days would never come. We promised to be prepared for when they did. Yuri Mirov had said then, the Earth Trust director's broad smile flashing from the country's every telescreen. Now we are ready. Now we are coming to the rescue. 2 weeks later, unmarked convoys of soldiers and squadrons of lifter drones swarmed the West Coast, rescuing whoever they could, whether or not the victims wanted rescuing, and evacuating them to resettlement camps hastily erected in the Mojave, then to Ohio, where the first volunteer agriculture community was being built even as Oregon and Washington seceded. In those days, John had been in Ohio too, with Earth Trust, with Yuri. He'd known her since childhood, but in those first months of the country's collapse, he felt constantly off balance, unable to understand how Yuri had moved so fast, carrying out previously unspoken plans with a brutal, tactical efficiency he hadn't realized she possessed. When he left her company years after his first misgivings, he fled into the sacrifice zone with Cal and the others also quitting the Earth Trust, all of them together promising to somehow one day push back. He hadn't wanted to meet violence with more violence like Cal had. He simply wanted to atone for his part in what had happened, for the world he'd helped bring into being. Today he arrives at Yellowstone's Lamar Valley by noon, driving a browning landscape whose mountains no longer promise any hint of snowpack, only burned trees cascading down the slopes. John parks his truck at the top of a narrow ridge, leaving the unmaintained park road to walk into the valley on foot. 30 years ago, John's father had brought his son here to share his awe of this greatest of America's preserves, the size of its wild enough herds of buffalo and elk and bighorn sheep, the promise of spotting wolves at dawn. As a child of 10, John stood shoulder to shoulder with other tourists to watch the last pristine bison herd, the Lamar Valley bison, the only such animals never interbred with cattle to make them tamer, more amenable to human contact. Now the Lamar Valley's previous beauty has become a starkness unbroken by movement, its emptiness a bleak power. John takes in the eerie near silence of the valley, no sound except the wind rustling dry plants, the river trickling down below. At the river's edge, he momentarily closes his eyes to listen to the water's gentle rush, whispering over worn rocks, breathing deep the elusive scents of the dry grass and the sparse plants along the riverbank. Before he opens his eyes, he tries to picture that long-ago day spent at some similar part of this river with his father, and the hundreds of bison roaming the prairie have been entirely uninterested in the encroaching crowds. He's come today hoping for any sign of the old magic he'd sensed then, so different from what he felt amid the fields of his father's farm. If he could only see that something of the wild majesty that was had returned to this place, to these parklands emptied of people with the rest of the sacrifice. But when he scans the opposing bank's tree line, his gaze meets not the bison he craves, but instead the narrow wedge of a wolf's curious face, impassively peering from the pines. John startles. He knows he shouldn't approach. The wolf's 100 meters away, atop a steep embankment on the opposite side of the river, but he can't help himself. How lonely he's been, how devastated he's become by his aloneness in the months as he last saw Cal or any of the others he'd come west with. Now his loneliness covers every empty landscape, anywhere once home to more bountiful life. He fords the river, splashing loudly, the wolf already backing away from the tree line. Slowed by his sloshing boots, John clambers atop the ridge, pulling himself up by the fracturing branches of the dry pines. He's soon out of breath, breathlessly hopeless. Likely the wolf was never there, just more wishful thinking in a world quick to punish us thoughts. But then he finds it again, 20 meters away, gray-furred, steel-eyed, healthy enough, with no sign of mange or malnutrition. The wolf permits John's gaze, gazes back. Then it begins to nose through the grass as something John at first can't quite see, then can't look away from. Surrounding the wolf are the corpses of dead bison, erratic boulders of shaggy fur. John approaches slowly, wary of the wolf and his snuffling progress. He counts a dozen giant bodies, then glimpses more hidden by the rustling grass. Here, a powerful leg ending in a strangely dainty hoof. There, a horn curving through the stalks. Through the tall cover, he sees an unnervingly large yellow eye, open and staring, jaundiced and bloodshot. It's all he can see of a massive head, except for the curve of one broken horn, the rest of its bulk obscured. The eye is cloudy, staring at nothing. And then it moves, rolls crazily in the broad, black-furred face. John cries out, unnerved. The wolf continues to pace nearby, unperturbed, its tongue lolling loose between its teeth. Watching John inch toward the injured bison, the wolf's face is blank, its mask that of every wild mammal, full of nuances John's never learned to read. When it gets too close, it barks with a high-pitched yip, then barks again. The sound sharper now. At this second yip, the bison cries out too, its mournful groan shivering John's skin. He carefully pushes back the grass to reveal the unbelievable bulk of the injured animal, its hooves jerking dreamily, its bodily rocking in the dusty earth as it tries and fails to stand. It's a last juvenile, orphaned and alone, its stout ribs pressing through stretched skin and matted fur, its bold shoulders too atrophied to lift its heavy skull. John kneels, rests his hand on the bison's bony crown. The bison snuffles, presses back against his touch. Or so John imagines. Not everything in the world exists for him, and certainly not this futureless herd. The wolf lingers nearby, packless in this valley where the most successful reintroduction program in the country once thrived. It stalks uncannily from corpse to corpse, nosing each of the dead bison in turn, sniffing and prodding, but not eating. Something's wrong. A wolf alone would ordinarily pass up such an easy meal. John stands, determined to shoot away from the juvenile. As he rises, he hears, distant but closing fast, the telltale sound of approaching rotors. John flees quick as he can, back the way he came, sliding down the slope, feet clumsy in wet boots. He hits the river fast, slipping into the shallow water, crashing over loose rocks. Only when his scramble reaches the other bank does he risk a look back. Above the ridge, a dozen drones fly, heavy lifter quadcopters with bright yellow claws dangling underneath, arrayed in formation around a cargo drone the ungainly size of a dump truck. John should keep running, but curiosity and duty override his caution. He reverses direction, heads back across the cold river, and crawls up the bank to pause among the pines of the rise's lip. The noise from above is incredible, the downward thrust of the drone's rotors flattening the prairie to expose more corpses alongside the barely breathing juvenile and the improbably calm wolf. The heavy lifters descend, belly-mounted winches dropping claws on high-tension cables, their serrated jaws opening to dig into dead weight. One by one, they ferry the bison into the cargo drone's open hatch, its bulk swaying and dipping with each catch, until one final drone lowers itself over the last living Yellowstone bison. John forces himself to watch. The juvenile bellows a sustained cry, guttural and grieving, as it struggles against the steel claw. Its legs kick with late strength as it's lifted from the brown grass, its hooves running futilely on air until the drone deposits it among the massed dead of its herd. John hears the creaking cargo doors closing, then the heavy, rushing wind of the drones turning in formation. Soon the sky is empty, not even a cloud remaining to color the sunset. Once again, the voice of the world reduces to the howl of hot wind crossing the lonely expanse of the Lamar Valley, rasping the thrashed and flattened grasses where the bison lay down to die. Only the wolf remains, sitting on its haunches, staring at John, its expression blank, but its eyes alive, watching. As the wolf finally rises and trots away, headed in the same direction the drones flew, John begins to shiver, his skin goose-flushing. It's 100 degrees in Yellowstone today, 100 degrees at least. But once John begins shivering, he can't stop, not for a long time. not until his anger once again overtakes his fear.
Thank you. All right, Todd, I'm sure you have a lot to ask about that.
Well, since Matt kind of already led on, there's a sort of a mythological plot line in the Chapman section, and there's a kind of an adventure plot line, but also a heist plot line in there. And since just this morning I was talking to my students about the nature of a heist as a fantasy that grows out of a sense of discontent, right? That the powerful have used the system to aggrandize themselves, and that what people have to do is act in response. And knowing what happens in this chapter, but not wanting to give too much away, I wanted to ask a question that was kind of in there, like were you kind of thinking that that a heist as a fantasy allows people to think, well, what can we do, a la Robin Hood or Prometheus or Adam and Eve, when you must transgress in order to set something right?
Yeah, I like that idea. I think it's sort of obvious, probably to most of us in the room, that often people in power sort of set the terms of the language that's used to describe people and describe their actions. Being used the term rewilders for the John and his friends, is how they think of themselves. The Earth Trust calls them terrorists, right? This is sort of like the person who's setting the terms gets to describe who you are in that way. So there is some of that. And then I think there's partly whenever you're up against a superior sort of power structure, like some of these tactics will inevitably be some of the things that are chosen, right? You can't compete directly. Part of this what's happening in the political situations book is sort of a failure of democracy. Like people are basically asked to give up their citizenship in return for being saved, really, from climate change. And so there's a decrease in direct democratic action that could be taken. And so some things like the heist narrative or some of the sort of protest things that happen late in the book are the only avenues sort of available to people.
And this section is so interesting in that it begins in the same kind of forested way.
Yeah.
You're obviously trying to guide our attention
to
the connection to the bison, because of the details that are connected with Chapman, right? A broken horn and the same kind of thing. And so I think that this is one of the ways when people go, this isn't science fiction, it's speculative, right? These are the literary moves that are trying to do work with language that oftentimes, when you think of science fiction, it's plot, right? Like there's a plot, we're going to get things through, we're going to turn pages, but you're doing some extra work. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about what you're doing, because the plot is in place, the concepts and the ideas are in place, but there's this other layer which isn't common with everything, particularly in popular fiction. This language layer, which sometimes is a barrier for some readers, because what they really want to do is motor through interesting language, like the language that you're using, beautiful language, can tend to be that kind of thickening agent and maybe it slows people down. That doesn't happen in this book, by the way. He's solved that problem. You motor through this thing. But I just kind of wanted to set that up and see what you might want to say about language.
Gary L. Lutz makes a distinction between page-turning language and page-hugging language that asks you to sort of stay with it. And I do think I have a preference for sort of page-hugging language as a reader and writer. Although I do think every book there's these thematic things, the 1.5, but there's also stylistic things. And one of the things I really did want to learn to do in this book was write a faster paced kind of book and a more propulsive book. And so I'm glad that sort of works. There's actually a point in it where both my editor and my agent were like, it's really fast after this point. And I'm like, that's right, I learned how to do that. And I could never quite back it out to the beginning. But I think to not pay attention, making interesting, lovely language is one of the joys of being a writer. So to not do that seems like a lost opportunity for yourself as well. But I really do think, even if you never hear it aloud, the book works on you on the level of sort of music that you hear when you read, or most of us hear when we read. And so that language is having a bodily effect on you as well. It's something that you're physically creating with your voice, even if it's only in your ear, in your mind. and you hear it loud, it does things to you in the way that music does. And it seems to only affect your reader on the level of plot is to leave half the tools on the table. But to only affect your reader on the level of language is also to leave half the tools on the table, right? But that both story and sort of music can work together in this way. The other, you're talking about something like the broken horns and some of these things. In revision, I'm often looking for ways to reuse things or to bring things into another part of the story. Charles Baxter calls it like rhyming action, where an action repeats or an image repeats in another part of the book. And sometimes it repeats exactly, sometimes it's like a slant rhyme, right? It's something that recalls the other action, recalls the other piece of dialogue. And I think we find that really pleasing as readers. I think it actually makes you, it almost creates like a memory trigger to the other part of the book, and it connects these things in the way we experience in real life. But I find that very sort of powerful as a move generally. Maybe you get more out of, like, I think maybe I used to think like writing a book was like something new had to happen in every page, like it was novelty for 300 pages. But I don't think that's necessarily what has to happen. When you think about music composition, right? Like songs have choruses for reasons, right? Things repeat for a reason. And I think novels and short stories have the same opportunities at the level of image and language and action.
Sometimes I've told my students when we're trying to talk through this, like, why would you do this? And one of the things is it's clues the writer leaves behind to say, look, there's a design.
Yeah.
And when somebody finds those patterns in their own reading, they also get a chance to feel smart.
Yeah.
Right? They get to.
I feel smart when I find in my own book. I'm
right.
Like, oh, that's a possibility I could do. Yeah.
And sometimes it even happens when the patterns are pointed out by other readers, and whether it's an agent or an editor who goes, "Did you know that you're doing this?" And you go, "Tell me more."
Right.
Because there's a part of us that we don't always get to talk to directly that sometimes is a lot smarter than we are.
Oh yeah.
And one of the things that happens in the writing process is you get to kind of let that force out.
Yeah.
And it gets to be smart. And I don't know if you've ever caught this. I've had this. I'm like, oh, this word appeared in my book. I don't ever use that word.
Right.
And so that's been like to give me the hard edges of something else is happening here than just regular thinking. And maybe that's something to talk about too in the process.
Sure.
Like when you're composing, things happen that aren't like what you do when you're driving through to get a sandwich.
Right.
Like it's a different line.
Buying sandwiches. But
yeah, it's definitely side by side in that one, but they're different processes.
Yeah. I think one of the real joys of the writing process and how we end up with books that feel like, when you read a book and it feels like it's written by like a superhuman intelligence, it's like how was that done? How could anyone be that smart? I think the thing I've learned writing is that it doesn't. I mean, there are probably some people who are just that smart, but like I'm not. And I think what happens is like the book, your task on any given day is never to write a whole book. Like your task is to like write this scene or work on this piece of language or figure out this plot problem or research this thing. And I think of it as like manifesting on the page or in the novel. And so you work on it took me 3.5 years to write this. I write 5 days a week, so whatever that works out to, like 1,200 days of writing or 1,300 days of writing. And like each of those 1,300 versions of me brought something to the page. And they solved the problem that only that base person could solve. It's amazing how often like you've worked on it for 2 years and suddenly one day you're just like, oh, that's how you do that part. You know, and like that person adds that. And so when you read the final book, it has this like super intelligent version of yourself, and all the people you were for that time did it, and then your editor helps and your agent helps, and like and they make you smarter too. But I really do think that sort of the reason books feel like they were written by like impossible humans is because they were written by 1,200 versions of you, or 1,200 versions of me, in the same way your compositions are made by many versions of you. And that's the reason to write often, and to have a long process for a book.
And this is baiting a little bit. A few days ago, Matt said out in the social medias about you had a period of time when you had to attend to other tasks.
Yeah.
And you were working on something else, and this is for a project you're working on now, and you came back and went,
yep,
I solved the problem, but you weren't talking about it. So we got in that conversation there, and I think that this is that, right? Yep. What is it that happens? It feels like maybe it's inspiration, but something's going on where I wasn't thinking about it, but I've solved the problem anyway.
Yeah, and in like in this instance, my brother had been in town for like 4 days, so I've been writing. I've just been hanging out with him. But like maybe the version of me that had spent 4 days with his brother was different than me who hadn't seen his brother in 2 years. You know, like
so it's Dr. Strange. It just steps away and it does the work while we're attending to other things and then comes back.
Well, usually my last question is about advice for students, but what we just did was amazing advice. To really sit with yourself, learn with yourself, allow yourself that time to explore. And amazingly, our time has flown by. But the conversation is not over. We are all three going to be on the radio today at 3 p.m., which will also be recorded for our podcast. So you're welcome to join us live on the radio on KSU Youth under 91.1 or listen for the podcast. And we do have copies of Appleseed here for sale and signing by the author. So please join us in the lobby. But in the meantime, we're going to press pause until later this afternoon. Thank you so much, Todd. Thank you, Matt, for coming and being here. Thank you to everyone for coming, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, all.